The integumentary system is the skin and all of its accessories. The function of your skin is protection. Protection from viruses and bacteria. It's your first line of defense in your immune system. It helps with temperature maintenance. When you sweat, it can cool down your body. Synthesis and storage of nutrients. It's important for vitamin D production. Sensory reception, so knowing when you are touching something. And excretion and secretion. You secrete salts across your skin through sweat. There are 4 types of membranes. A serous membrane lines a cavity that has no opening to the outside. It secretes serous fluid. The serous fluid is there to help reduce friction of organs hitting up against it. It lines the thorax and the abdomen, so it would line the inside of the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. The mucous membrane lines cavities that open to the outside. It secretes mucus, and it's found in the oral, nasal, digestive, reproductive, and respiratory tracts. So these all have holes that open to the outside. Any opening that you have that goes to the outside will be covered in a mucous membrane. The mucus is there to help trap bacteria and viruses before getting too far inside the body. So hopefully that mucus will catch it before it gets to invade the rest of your tissues. Then we have synovial membranes. Synovial membranes line joint cavities and secrete synovial fluid. Synovial fluid helps reduce friction between the ends of the bones as they're sliding past one another. When you lose synovial fluid, you're going to start having bone rub on bone, and that can be painful. And that's actually one of the things that causes arthritis. And then we have our cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane is actually made up of the skin, and there are 2 distinct layers of the skin. There's the more waterproof outside, the epidermis, and then there's that kind of more living layer of the dermis underneath. The epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. There are 2 types of epidermis. We have thick skin and we have thin skin. The thick skin is approximately 5 layers, and you have them on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. These are used often, so it needs to be a little bit thicker to withstand the repetitive use. Thin skin is 4 layers, and that's on the rest of the body. Of these 5 layers, the outermost layer, the layer that you see, is a stratum corneum. This is the dead layer. All of these cells have been filled with a keratin or a protein and are no longer living. So these cells have no DNA in them. If you were to find these cells, you would not be able to get any DNA evidence from them. If you take off those top 4 or 5 layers, the bottom of the epidermis is called the stratum basal. This is the alive layer of the epidermis. This is the layer at the basement membrane that creates all the cells, and that as they age, they get pushed up from below and flatten out and keratinize as they get towards the surface. Looking at the picture, the stratum corneum is this outermost layer here. The stratum basal is this layer here that sits right at the basement membrane. The epidermis has no blood supply. All of the nutrients come from diffusion from the blood that lays below. Right underneath that stratum basal is some blood vessels, and those blood vessels, the nutrients will diffuse from those blood vessels into those cells above. The outermost layer of the skin is dead, and those don't need nutrition. So as you get further and further away from that stratum basal, the less and less nutrient you need to stay alive. Also in this layer, we have stem cells. They are cells that form the new cells to replace all of the dead ones. As I said before, we have keratin, that is a protein that fills in the cells as they age. They become a little bit more water resistant, and it gives a coating to the skin. Your hair and your nails are also keratinized. Melanocytes are cells that produce your skin color. They make melanin. The more melanin you have, the darker your skin tone. When looking at the melanocyte here in this picture is the yellow. It kind of spreads through those keratinized cells of the epidermis. The more melanin those melanocytes make, the darker the skin tone. And then we have keratin. Keratin is the durable protein that fills in this epidermis cells as they age. It is a water-resistant protein, and it gives us a more coating to the skin. Your hair and your nails is also made out of keratinized cells. When we are replacing our skin, it generally takes about 2 weeks for this to happen. The cells start at the bottom, at the stratum basal, in the lower layer of that epidermis. As they age, they get pushed up from those cells at that bottom layer, kind of dividing and pushing those cells up. As they move up, they lose oxygen and nutrients, and the nutrients can't diffuse as far. And so keratin starts to grow within those cells, and they die. And they stay in the top 15 to 30 layers for about 2 weeks. And they are either shed off or washed off. Anytime that you get dressed or you take a shower, you're sloughing off a lot of those cells. Most of the dust that you see in the air is actually dead skin cells. Underneath the epidermis is the dermis. The dermis is the supporting part of the cell. The dermis is that layer that has all of the nutritive parts of the skin. There are undulations within the dermis. This is what creates the basic fingerprint. The exact fingerprint is made from when you're in utero in your mom's belly and you press the inside of your mom's belly as your fingers are developing. And as you do that, you smush these undulations in a different manner, giving you a different fingerprint. This is the reason why no one has the same exact fingerprint, because you just happen to press differently on the inside of the belly as you're being formed. The dermis is this layer here. You can see that this layer is full of blood vessels, nerves, muscles, glands. The dermis contains blood and lymph vessels, as well as nerves. The hair follicles are located in the dermis. Sweat glands and sebaceous glands are also found in the dermis. Looking at the picture, the red and the blue tubes, those are all blood vessels. The blue ones are the veins and the red ones are the arteries. The hair follicle is here. Associated with each hair follicle is a sebaceous gland. This would be the sebaceous gland here. There are sweat glands. Sweat glands tend to look like a coil. This here is a sweat gland. This here is also a sweat gland. Associated with each follicle is a muscle. It's called the erector pili. It causes hair to stand on end. In humans, this would give us goosebumps. Underneath the dermis is the hypodermis, hypo meaning below. This is also known as a subcutaneous layer. I tend to use subcutaneous layer, but if you see hypodermis or use hypodermis, it is the same thing. The subcutaneous layer is mostly made of loose connective tissue and adipose. If you've ever had a raw piece of meat or chicken and you're taking the skin off, or you're taking the fat off, and there's that flat, thin layer of white stuff, that is actually loose connective tissue. Adipose is fat. This layer provides insulation and also attaches the skin to the underlying organs. The subcutaneous layer is very elastic, and it's where most of your injections go. When you get a vaccine, most of the vaccines are going to go in the subcutaneous layer. The ones that are very painful are going to go intramuscular and going to go into the muscle. Dogs and cats have a much more elastic or flexible subcutaneous layer, because if you think about like the scruff on the neck, you can bring up their skin quite far because that subcutaneous layer is quite elastic. Large blood vessels will run through this area. When you are getting your blood drawn, it is drawn generally from one of these large blood vessels in the subcutaneous layer. There are some hair follicles that are a little bit deeper, and a couple sweat glands as well. And then also the adipose, that fat tissue, to help insulate the body.